Thanks, Amanda, and thanks all of you for coming out. This is really great. You know, when you visit a place that you're not from, you always wonder if someone's gonna come out, so it's great to see all of you deciding to be here tonight. Can everybody hear me with a microphone? Yes? Okay, cool. So I'm gonna talk about my work as an artist. So during the Flotilla conference, I decided not to talk about my work at all, but to talk about other artists' works. So kind of wearing my hat as a curator. Today I got to wear my hat as an artist. But for some of you who were there for the Flotilla conference, you'll recognize, I think, several overlapping themes. So what I'm going to do today is I'll show you a series of works and then a little bit of kind of like research that has informed my work. And I'm not going to try to kind of give like a big overview of what I do, but just kind of follow one thread, right, out of many other possible threads. So I decided to start with this piece titled Eclipse. It's an artist multiple that I made in 2009. And it takes the form of a kind of, what is it called? Assisted ready-made, I guess. So it has a glass prosthetic eye in this kind of little wooden box with a velvet kind of cushion to house it. And I thought to start my presentation with this work. And just recall that at the time I was thinking about I guess perception and kind of what it means to perceive something. You know, we open our eyes and we see all sorts of things, right? I see a microphone, I see a lectern, chairs, people, the room. You know, we open our eyes and the visible world makes itself apparent to us. But it seems to me that all of this depends on the fact that we take up a point of view for all that to happen. But that very point of view is the one thing that itself does not appear in our field of view. So I was trying to think about like what would it mean to kind of almost objectivize the point of view, the position that we take as viewers, as perceivers, and to observe that as a kind of thing. So that this work in a sense makes that very literal. But in general, I started to think about that. Like what are those kind of basic things that are necessary and that we take for granted to be there for everything else to appear? Like, so I started to kind of like reflect on these kinds of questions. A year after this, so this is 2009, and then in 2010, I made an installation that's titled Pictures at an Exhibition. I exhibited this at the Darling Foundry in Montreal. So the Darling Foundry is, I guess, an old industrial foundry that has been converted to a gallery space. They also run a very interesting active program of like visiting artist residencies and artist studios for Montreal artists. So very lively place. And I was invited to do an exhibition, and the one work that I made for this exhibition is this installation. So I decided to build a gallery inside the gallery. So just like kind of objectivizing the eyeball as a thing to look at, turn the gallery context itself into a kind of object in the gallery to reflect on the situation of an exhibition and the behavior that we assume as viewers in a gallery. So the installation, as you see, took the form of this kind of prototypical like white cube inside the gallery space. And inside this white cube was a series of monochrome paintings, kind of like tones, colored gray tones. I'm very interested in the tradition of monochrome painting. It's something that I've been engaged with for a long time. And this kind of is a continuation of those concerns. And as you can see, one of the walls, one of the four walls of this white cube space is a glass wall, so that there's this kind of transparency and this relationship between those of us who are inside the white cube and those of us who are outside of the white cube looking in. I'll show a couple more images to kind of give you a sense of the installation. So this is a view looking from inside the installation now, looking out. The exhibition space is a kind of like industrial cathedral, so like very high ceilings with this kind of series of like clerestory windows. We closed all those up to give it a kind of fairly dark ambience. And then suspended a kind of like track lighting system that you find in so many galleries, but kind of was like almost like floating or hovering in space, which I think lent to the installation a kind of theatrical dimension, right? It was a real gallery with real paintings inside it, but it was also a performance of a gallery. It was a theatricization of a gallery. And I think suspending the lighting system without a roof emphasized that kind of fictional dimension of the setup. I also decided to put this gray carpeting, which to me is kind of like perverse. It's like a little, it kind of took it to a place that made it almost like, I don't know, it's sick somehow to me. But it seemed important to be there. It speaks of a kind of gallery, you know, and I wanted that dimension to be part of it. Here's a view looking at kind of an array of the monochrome paintings. And then this image kind of shows you the dynamic that happens between people now and engaging in the installation. So, you know, there's a sense that let's say I am looking at paintings inside of this installation, but kind of somewhere in the back of my mind, I recognize that I'm also an object for viewing by another viewer, right? By someone outside of the installation looking in. I become a kind of theatrical actor in a kind of theatricized stage. So my behavior takes on a kind of performative dimension as well as the kind of real dimension that we just do when we go and see an exhibition. This is kind of like focusing in onto the glass wall. And you know, you see how you can see on the glass doors here, like when it's dark outside, you can see through the glass as you do normally, but the glass starts to become a kind of mirror that also reflects what's inside and almost projects it out onto the darkness outside. So you see this kind of virtual series of monochromes like ghosts kind of being projected out into the dark space outside. And this is looking at it from the other side. It was quite interesting to look at the installation from a distance from outside because of the darkness of the space and the internal illumination of this installation. It also had a kind of cinematic quality, like it felt like a projection. And this photograph kind of suggests that idea of this kind of internal lighting that gives it a kind of filmic quality, especially when there's people moving around inside the installation. Later that same year, so also 2010, I did an installation called Album 10. It's not an installation, it's an artwork titled Album 10. It's part of a series of albums that I've been doing since 2000, so this is the 10th in the series. And each of the albums consists of images that I've cut out from books and magazines, so like literally just cut out images, and assembled them in these plastic laminate sheets. So it's not so much a collage, it's almost like a scrapbook, it's more properly a montage of images on these kind of scrapbook sheets. And then the sheets are arranged chronologically. And in each sheet, there are images from different sources. So they could be like art magazines, psychology textbooks, I don't know, books on history or gardening or all sorts of publications, you know, basically from like secondhand books, like just buying cheap printed material. And assembled together, even though these images are produced from different sources and for different purposes, there's something in common with the images that kind of brings them together, and you start to kind of see relationships. And as you go from panel to panel, these relationships start to weave like narrative threads. So there's a kind of storytelling or narrative dimension to this piece. When I showed this at MoCA in Toronto, so the Museum of Canadian Contemporary Art, they just took out one of the C's. They took out the Canadian C, so now it's Museum of Contemporary Art. So I wonder what that's going to do to their programming. But anyway, it had two C's at the time. And I asked them if it'd be possible for us to build a kind of architectural frame for the album. In a way to follow up from this piece in Montreal, there's a kind of fiction of a gallery inside of the gallery. And they were great to work with. Obviously, this is a lot more work than simply to install it on the wall. But they recognize that it's an important part of the piece. And some of this is kind of reflected in the story of the album itself. So I'm going to focus on a couple of panels. So you see like two panels next to each other. And this, I think, gives you a sense of some of the kind of visual association that kind of is the logic behind gathering these images. This one album is particularly like arty, like there are images of artworks from art magazines. So there's a larger reference to art in this album than it is to other albums. But in here, you can kind of see, in common, it's this idea of like pictures, framed pictures on a wall in an exhibition, right? So at the beginning of the album, you kind of get this as a kind of initiating, guiding theme. And as you can see, like on that top right image, the basic frame becomes kind of detached as an autonomous object that itself becomes almost like an object for contemplation. So not what is framed in the frame, but the frame itself becomes a kind of tangible object. So now we start to move away from a picture idea to a kind of more object or contextual idea. And then as the narrative of the album progresses, you get this pairing of sheets where it starts to, where this kind of, the picture becomes a kind of monochrome or an absent picture. And what does it mean to look at a kind of absent picture or a picture of nothing or a monochrome, right? So on the top left, we have like a photograph by Hiroshi Sugimoto, a series of photographs that he took. He kind of became well known for these. He went to different theaters, like fairly grand cinemas around the world, and he shot a photograph with a long exposure for the duration of a whole film. Now, because the film is moving, it just appears as white light, but that white light becomes what illuminates the dark and architectural space. So you don't see what the movie is, you just see what the cinema is, but it's lit by the cinema, by the film projection. On the bottom left, you have a piece by Alfredo Yar, Lucio Fontana on the top right, with his X-Acto knife in his hand, he's about to make the cut. Rothko checking out one of his paintings. So this idea of kind of the body in relationship to the monochrome. And then once again, further along in the album, this idea of the frame takes on a kind of architectural dimension. So not so much a frame for a picture on the wall that we're kind of separate from, that we are looking at. But as architecture, we're kind of inside the frame, right? And we are the picture in a sense, right? And so to think about kind of what does that mean to consider the environment that we're in as a kind of frame? What does that, what's our relationship to those framing contexts? There's a nice picture on the bottom right. I love it. It's almost like people getting caught up on the stretcher of a canvas, of a painting. Like the stretcher is so big that it's almost like swallowing up the bodies of these people. It's a remarkable image. It's an image, I think, from the 1940s when Picasso painted Guernica, like his famous Guernica painting. It's a protest piece. And as part of its life, its initial life, it went in a tour around the world for several years to raise awareness around questions of fascism in Europe, in Spain, etc. And of course, it's such a gigantic painting, they couldn't ship an object like this, so they had to like roll it up, ship it, and it had to be unrolled, stretched, hung, displayed, and then unstretched, rolled, and shipped to the next venue. So on the floor, you have Guernica sitting on the floor, like lying down, which is kind of amazing, because it's such a valuable, important painting. And these two people are trying to kind of negotiate the immense stretcher that the canvas required. Another pairing further along, where the relationship to the tableau becomes very confusing. It's hard to tell like clearly what's on one side and what's on the other, because there's a kind of mirroring that's happening from one side to the other. A couple of years later, so now this is 2013, I decided to do this silkscreen print called The Demonstration. So as you can see, it continues this idea of the monochrome. So it's a two-color silkscreen print. So there's a color pull that's a kind of off-white. It's just off the color of the paper itself. And then on top of that color is the black that gives you the kind of photographic image. And so the square that's being demonstrated is just the raw, empty paper. But because it's surrounded by a background of kind of a color that's just off of that color, the raw, kind of naked paper has a kind of hovering quality, like it feels like it's almost like in front of the page or in front of the paper. I'm very fond of this piece. And I love like an artwork that thematizes the gesture of demonstrating, of showing something, right? Artworks like these, for example, are exhibited, they're being demonstrated, right? A gallery is a space for exhibition, for demonstrating, showing something. What does it mean to have an object meant to be shown that thematizes the gesture of showing, right? Yeah, you can see some stretchers in the background, like the back of a canvas, a kind of empty stretcher, and even the shipping box, you know, like where, you know, such an essential part of getting a piece to a place of exhibition includes all the shipping kind of infrastructure necessary to make the work visible. So the frame of this, the image that frames this monochrome is kind of talking about all those things of the raw material, the empty stretcher before, you know, the flip side of the canvas, all the invisible work and the infrastructure that is required for an active demonstration to happen. I also think it just looks pretty. I like it. Then a couple of years after that, so now we're moving closer to today, so now it's 2015. I did an exhibition, an installation titled Sphinx. So it took the form of this figurative statue surrounded by a series of vitrine tables that showed a collection of publications of books. This was shown in the context of Nuit Blanche in Toronto that year, so 2015, and I was delighted to have this venue to work with. So it's in Allen Gardens, it's one of the kind of city parks. But what's special about Allen Gardens is that it has these like greenhouses, these public greenhouses. And one of the greenhouses is this kind of, I think they call it like children's pavilion or something like that. It's not used for plants, it's used for like kind of kids' workshops and stuff like that. And they let us use it as a place to exhibit this. So I really love the fact that it's kind of in a cultivation space surrounded by greenery. It kind of created like a different aura for the piece than if it was in a gallery or in a different kind of space. At around this this time I started thinking a lot about kind of the context in which I live and work. Like in my case, it happens to be the city of Toronto. So I started to reflect, like, how does this environment, Toronto, shape who I am, right? I've lived there since I was 10. Surely it's gotten under my skin in ways that I probably am not aware of. It reflects itself in what I do, probably in many ways that I'm not aware of. It affects the kind of encounters that I have with people and their work, maybe in ways that I'm also not aware of. So I started to really reflect on that, right? What is the place, the role of a place in relation to the culture that happens in that place, right? So I started kind of digging in, like, I want to know about Toronto. I don't know that much about it. I just know kind of what I need to do, like, you know, where my house is, where my whatever is. But I don't really know so much about what this place is as such, like how it came to be like this. What are the forces that make it what it is? So the statue is kind of, you know, loosely speaking, it refers to, like, you know, these Roman, like, marble statues. So that kind of tradition, and it's a figure making this kind of like, almost like framing gesture, almost like a kind of selfie or like taking a photograph gesture. He's headless, so there's a kind of funky situation going on. And then I'll show you some images of the books that were in the vitrines. So I'm a nerd. I love going to secondhand books and just kind of rummaging and finding cheap treasures that nobody likes, but that I worship. So I've been collecting, I've been like basically ransacking all the secondhand bookstores and just finding the most amazing material that nobody wants, so it's really cheap. So these books from like this part of it is kind of around the 1950s going into the 60s. The top publications are the same Metropolitan Toronto, 1958. It was part of a series of published by Metropolitan Toronto. So Toronto at this time had a really interesting kind of governance structure where there was kind of like City Hall and the elected representatives, and there was Metropolitan Toronto. So there were kind of like two parallel systems of governance. Metropolitan Toronto was in charge of kind of infrastructure and kind of long-term planning in terms of like urbanization, roads, sewage, power, electricity, things like that. And the idea was to kind of separate the political dynamics of the city and decision-making from the kind of bare bones like infrastructural decision-making of like urban planning. And people from around the world were looking to Toronto because it was actually a really interesting model for governance that produced many interesting things. I'm sure it wasn't all like ideal and utopian, but it was a kind of interesting and unusual model. That ended, I think, in '94 or something like that, when kind of the cities were forced to amalgamate. And anyway, but in the 50s, Metropolitan Toronto was publishing these kind of pamphlets, these like 30-page pamphlets that were kind of talking about what they had accomplished that year, what their kind of future plans were in terms of like urbanization. And they're just beautiful, amazing documents that really capture a kind of moment and a way of thinking about the city. So you can imagine in 1958, you know, it's definitely no longer kind of Victorian city. It's no longer, well, it's kind of at the cusp of being like an industrial city and not being an industrial city. The modern hasn't hit quite yet in Toronto. So, and you can really feel that, but it is starting, and you can kind of feel that sense of transition in how they depict their activities. And then here's kind of a little bit later, like going through the 60s towards the early 70s. You know, the aesthetic changes, like the modes of representation, things get a lot more technocratic, a lot more kind of modernist visions of urban planning that has to do with like statistics and kind of systems analysis. So very kind of technocratical viewpoints start to come to the fore. But also they start to be challenged towards the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s. You know, that top right one that says 1970 with this very kind of rounded borders starts to, I think, even like at the level of graphic design, it starts to speak of a kind of critique of very rigid ideas towards urbanization. When you compare it to like the two to the left of it that seem very like map-like, like almost like scientific or something like that. I see that even in the rounded contours of the city plan, there's a kind of implicit critique or a new idea coming to the fore around this time of 1970. They're all really interesting books. I'm just kind of giving you like a quick overview. Now we're kind of like in the 70s proper, where this kind of critical perspective is really thematized, like what kind of city, like even to raise the question, like not what it is, but what could it be, or what do we desire? I love that, they had a kind of cutout on the cover with a piece of the puzzle inside the eyeball. I think of the eclipse image that I show you at the very beginning, this idea of the eye and the city, etc. And so this whole series of publications, kind of I would say from the 1940s to about 2015. So quite a range of time periods. Like you see like the city, the same in quote city, being depicted, understood, analyzed, described in so many different ways, right? From a kind of pre-modern period through a high modern period, through a kind of a period that's critical of modernism, to a kind of, there's like a moment of like a grassroots critique happening, to a kind of squashing of that through neoliberalization. And I like to think that this Sphinx is kind of beholding all of that, and kind of, that's what the Sphinx is trying to kind of frame, view, be viewed by. I like his weird genitals too. Like they're kind of obscene, and I'm interested in the fact that he's decapitated, that kind of this headlessness in relationship to kind of decision making. I think it's an important idea to think about. I don't know if folks have like questions or comments. Like, just if you do, just put up your hands like at any point, or we can save it for a Q&A at the end, whatever you want. Later that year in 2016, I decided to do another silkscreen print as a kind of like follow-up to the demonstration print of a couple of years before. So this is a silkscreen print called The Ward that also shows a kind of monochrome within this context of like questions dealing with place, the city in which I live and work, even urbanization and those kinds of things. So I'm kind of showing you a trajectory of like a changing kind of way of thinking. So now I'm kind of gonna switch gears a little bit. So I've been talking about the art that I've been making. Now I'm gonna kind of veer and show some images of things that are part of my research that have kind of helped me arrive at this kind of work. The first image that I'd like to show is this document titled The Toronto Purchase. It's a historical document that codifies an agreement that was conducted between the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nation and the British Crown. This is in 1787, so very end of the 18th century, that pertains to the territory that now we call Toronto. Obviously a very significant document if you're gonna think about place in Toronto. And I'm very intrigued in particular by the right-hand side. I'm trying to imagine like these British people and just what did they see? Like when they opened their eyes, what did they see, right? I imagine they saw a very complex ecosystem, fish, birds, trees, I imagine that they saw very weird and interesting geographical features. You see a little bit of it in the drawing, in the diagram, with the Humber River and the Don River, the distinctive peninsula that was there at the time. It's now an island. There was a storm in the 19th century that broke the land bridge. So what used to be a peninsula is now an island. It's a place I love to go to in the summer. It's kind of become my necessary, like, I don't know, pressure valve. That's where I go to the beach. So I can recognize it. I see it, and I'm like, oh, that's where Hanlon's Point is. That's where, like, I love to, like, swim in Lake Ontario. So, you know, the shoreline is a little bit, like, identifiable. Like, I can kind of recognize some bits of it, although, of course, it's been changed a lot since the time that this was drawn. I also imagine that the surveyor, like, saw people, you know, with economic relationships, cultural relationships, international relationships. You know, this area was a place where people of different nations would have come to do trade for a long time. And I'm intrigued to see that all of these things appear as a kind of empty rectangle in the drawing, right? And so I like to ask myself, what does that mean? Like, when you open your eyes and you see what you see, and then when you represent it, it appears as a kind of blankness or a kind of emptiness, right? This gesture of making a frame that designates something as empty as waiting for something, right? Because the thing hasn't arrived, isn't here, right? The thing is going to come, but nothing is here right now. That's a weird gesture. It's a complex gesture. It's a gesture that I'm sure is repeated, we repeated over and over again. So it's worth thinking about this. So now I'm going to show you a couple of images of a drawing that was made a year after this one. So 1788, this drawing by John Collins called Plan for the Harbor of Toronto. And this is also another interesting gesture, right? Like, if you start out with a kind of this, like, empty frame, or this, you know, I like to call it the vacant lot. I spoke about that during Flotilla. So the name that I like to call this monochrome is the vacant lot, right? Thinking of the environment as a vacant lot. But then there's another gesture happening here. Is you start out with a vacant lot, and the second gesture seems to be you put a grid on the vacant lot, right? You subdivide it. And that seems to me to be a gesture that prepares the environment for being considered as property, right? As bits that can be claimed and owned. It's a weird gesture. It's a complex gesture, but I also think it's very important. You know, not to make too heavy a point, but, like, even our chairs, like on a grid, even before we arrive, implies that each of us take a seat in that chair and we claim that chair as our own. It's very convenient to do that. It's very good that we can do that so that we can have a talk like this. But it's interesting to think about what these models model for us and what kind of place they establish for us in the ways that we inhabit it. Uh-huh.
What's the scale on the
I imagine there would be, but
I'm just wondering if there's no scale and there are no, well, I guess there's a reference to a river. If there's no kind of references even to the natural landscape, the vagueness of that would allow you to kind of go.
yeah, I mean, you imagine that there would be much more okay, so the question was there a scale provided to this drawing? Because otherwise, how would you know how big that rectangle is? I don't know this document in detail to tell you what the scaling system used was, but I would expect that it being a formal agreement between two groups of people, there'd be some precision as to what they had agreed to. Having said that, this document, the Toronto Purchase was immediately challenged by the Mississaugas, because very quickly it became apparent that what one group thought they had agreed to and what the other group thought that they had agreed to were completely incompatible systems. And they've been contesting this for more than 200 years. So the Toronto Purchase was not ratified until 2010. So you can imagine the multi-generational effort it's required to sustain a challenge to this misunderstanding that took more than 200 years to, in quotes, resolve. So I think that's an important question that you're asking. So this is a plan for what to do with this Toronto Purchase, this territory. And John Collins' proposal was basically make a grid on it, right? This proposal itself was not followed, but the spirit of the letter, like the kind of worldview that this implies, was followed in the grid of the Toronto streets that we do have. So this precise arrangement was not followed, but the idea of basically laying out the settlement in a grid as a grid along concepts of land and space as territory was definitely followed. So now I'm going to jump a decade to 1797. So 11 years after this drawing, a couple of images by Sir David Williams. These are plans submitted for the enlargement of York. Here you have like those 12 pink squares are what are known as the 12 lots. They're the first kind of like urban settlement, like city blocks essentially, of Toronto. And you know, right at York, the harbor of Lake Ontario. Of course, now the shoreline is quite at a greater distance than it was at this time. And then this interesting kind of center block of quadrants. And it was really interesting to see, so like, you know, there's kind of hospital, jail, school, church, market. So the kind of like discipline and punish functions of the state all clustered conveniently together. But it's interesting to see it because it's like kind of following the rough outline. I can see like, oh, that church, that has to be St. James Cathedral. And the market, that has to be St. Lawrence Market, you know. The 12 lots are almost kind of completely gone, like they've been swallowed up by all sorts of other subsequent developments. St. George, no, what is it called? George Brown College campus is in this general area. So now it's a college. There's all sorts of other things. And yet this exists as a kind of, not skeleton, but as a kind of underlying matrix in the city that I live in and do stuff with. So it's really interesting to see like this drawing from 1797 showing the city that did get built, right? Even though it's changed, you can still kind of feel it if we were to walk around kind of this general neighborhood. But one interesting thing is I found another drawing by Sir David Williams where you literally see like people writing their names in each square of the grid, right? And so this is a kind of third gesture, right? Like first you have this kind of establishment of the vacant lot, like the environment considered as empty as nothing. Then this gesture of the grid being overlaid as a kind of conceptual reality on top of the existing universe. And that allows for the transformation of space as property. And here you literally see people seizing the space, right? Writing their names on each square of the grid. Pretty amazing to see these things. And then you kind of fast forward from this, like 150 years later, to take a look at this photograph. It's titled Conditions of Competition. It's a document from 1957 that you find in the city archives. So it's an aerial view of Toronto, around the mid-50s. I'm going to take the mic because I'm going to point to some stuff. So you see this kind of bird's eye view of the city. So this would be Queen Street, Bay Street, so kind of like the corporate towers are there now. This would be Dundas Street. University would be here. So quite central, like, downtown. This is the old City Hall. And this is the site of the new city hall of Villiers-Revel's kind of beautiful, like modernist city hall. Here's the Eaton's manufacturing area. So this giant complex of block after block after block after block of industrial buildings that were one of the manufacturing and distribution centers for the Eaton's empire. All of those are gone. It's now the Eaton Center, the mall. But I found this image really beautiful and precise in describing the persistence of this idea of the vacant lot 150 years after the Toronto Purchase document. It's amazing how constant this is. So this image was made by the city. Obviously, it's photoshopped in quotes, right? Like there is no monochrome in the middle of the city. They kind of like masked it out in the photograph. But the city made this photograph on occasion of an international architectural competition to decide on an architect for the new city hall, right? So in the 1950s, the city did this fairly innovative and really interesting thing of, instead of just hiring an architect, they put out an international competition. And the response was overwhelming. Something like, I hope I'm not making this up, but it's something like 400 or 500 proposals from around the world came. So they used like these vast buildings at the CNE, the Canadian National Exhibition grounds, and there are amazing photographs. They laid out like fields of tables with all these models, and they have to like figure out one design to like pick. But in preparation for this, they made this image and they gave it to all the architects so that they can start to kind of imagine the space as kind of empty and ready to receive their vision, right? Their architectural vision. So this, when I showed you the print, it's called The Ward, and that refers to this kind of general neighborhood. It's been colloquially known as The Ward. I think it originally was called like St. Joseph's Ward. I may be mistaken about that. But colloquially, it's called the Ward. And that's this general area is the Ward. And one interesting thing about the Ward is that, you know, like today, like we like to, I don't know if you guys do, but people in Toronto like to say like, oh, Toronto is very multicultural. It's like one of the most multicultural places in the world. I imagine that's true. I have no reason to contest it. But one interesting thing about the Ward is that this idea of multicultural Toronto was active in the 19th century in this neighborhood. So this is the non-British Toronto lived here, right? So in the mid 19th century, it was home to a large black population. So there's apparently, I think, 3 black churches in this neighborhood. In the early 20th century, it was also home to a lot of Jewish communities, Italian communities. The first Chinatown was there. And through the 40s and 50s and completed by the 60s, all of this neighborhood was gradually expropriated and bulldozed. So this, even though this is a kind of Photoshop image of a vacant lot that doesn't actually exist, don't be fooled, like it was put into action. Like all of this was razed to the ground, right? All the neighborhoods, all the people, all their ways of life were literally turned into a vacant lot. It's very powerful to see this image, this kind of like vision before the carrying out of the vacant lot. I've always wondered why, like on Dundas here, there's like a little stray Chinatown, you know, like, because Chinatown is like here, right? Like Dundas and Spadina. When you say like, let's go Chinatown, you go there. And then here on University, there's kind of big hospitals and big kind of corporate buildings. And then there's like a little cluster of Chinese restaurants and businesses. And I've always wondered, why is that there? Because they're in the wrong place. Well, the first Chinatown was there. That was a Chinese neighborhood. But during the process of eviction, some of the businesses are still there. So it's amazing to see also this kind of underlying matrix of this ward neighborhood still there, even though it's almost been completely bulldozed over. I've been looking for like representations of the ward before the vacant lot arrived. Lauren Harris made some paintings of the ward neighborhood. You know, one of the big group of 7 artists. He's really well known for his mountain paintings, his icebergs, etc. Before he was kind of making like typical group of 7 paintings, he was making a lot of representations of the ward. They're weird, but they're very beautiful paintings. So this is an image, you know, kind of like Impressionist style. So this is called Eaton's Manufacturing Building from 1911. So kind of, you know, like belated, like Impressionist style in terms of painterly technique. One of the manufacturing buildings that you saw in the photograph appears in this painting, so it's kind of amazing to see it. But it's taken from the point of view, and then in the foreground you see the kind of what you imagine are the workers' homes, right? Like the people who worked, who lived and worked in the ward, this is their homes. And then this kind of like high-rise looming in the background over their heads. I said weird because he painted, they're beautiful paintings, but he tended to, as an upper-class person, he tended to view the working-class neighborhood in a very weird way. You can imagine there'd be like a lot of blindness to what he's seeing, right? There's many things he can't see, even though, of course, he's there. Nevertheless, his paintings are important representations because we have few other representations to show us something about what the ward looked like. One other important source is the photographer Arthur Goss. So this is a photograph of the ward in 1910, so almost the same time as when Lauren Harris painted that painting I showed you. So all of this is that monochrome that was there before, right? Literally all of it. It's probably taken actually from one of the Eaton's manufacturing buildings, from the rooftop looking down, to look at this like, I mean, this is like city block after city block after city block. You can imagine like all the lives going on there that are represented as a kind of vacant lot in the photographic image from the 1957. Pretty amazing. And this is another aerial photograph of the ward in 1959, so 49 years after Arthur Goss. You can see the vacant lot being put into action. So already by 1959, things are being bulldozed. And the vacant lot is being made real in the environment. And then this is 1962. When I spoke at the flotilla, I kind of adopted this idea of the vacant lot as one of the guiding metaphors or motifs that I talked about. During that talk, I also talked about another kind of countervailing and almost like archetypally inverted motif, which I call the tangled garden. So I think about the tension between the view of the environment as a vacant lot and the view of the environment as a tangled garden. The tension that exists between these two views of our environment, that tension tells us something about Toronto, something very important, I think, about obviously not just Toronto, but colonial territory in general terms, capitalist territory in general terms. Obviously, different places are very different. They have all sorts of other tensions going on. But for me, this tension has let me see something about the place that I live in that I couldn't see before. I could maybe like intuit as vague sentiments or something. But this research is actually telling me something very significant and meaningful about the place where I live. I've been looking at other artists because I think other artists are similarly looking for these kinds of clues. Just to show one out of any number of people I could talk about is the series of photographs by Peter McCallum. took them in 1982. This is the intersection of King Street and Bathurst. So like I used to work like on this block here, like at our Metropole for many years, one of the artist run centers. And the series of 4 photographs that I'm about to show you shows you the kind of the process of the vacant lot being made real. So this Victorian warehouse being slowly like unbuilt until it becomes a vacant lot. And I don't know, this work, for example, shows me something very profound, that this kind of colonial idea of treating something as nothing that then can be owned. It's not something that like you start with an emptiness and then you, in quotes, fill in the blanks and then you're good. It seems to me that if you start with the assumption that the environment is a nothing, it'll always be a nothing. Like no matter what you do in it, at some level it is always a nothing. That's to say it means nothing, it has no value. You can annihilate it if it creates value, right? It literally doesn't mean anything. It has no value of its own. So it's interesting to think about this idea that this series of photographs of Peter McCallum's shows me that, oh, the vacant lot persists even when we, in quotes, fill in the blanks, right? And I think the continuity of like capitalism as rooted in colonialism, as rooted in slavery, on, and imperialism, these are not things that are in the past. These are not historical things in the sense that they're on the other side of this wall. They're actually like forms that persist, that we inhabit, that we take for granted, that I believe art can kind of make us think about. Thanks so much. No, so this is, when was it? 2015. So I've done more work since then. But for this kind of thread that I wanted to talk about today, it seemed like a kind of, it seemed to kind of concentrate so many of these questions that I've been talking about. I worked with Art Delela, who's a very talented sculptor in Toronto. I'm not a sculptor at all, so I can't mold for beans. But we worked together to make this piece. What is, I won't name names, but he was one of the dancers of the Toronto Dance Theatre. Yeah, let's compare notes later. Okay, to be very crude, he was so gracious to model. And obviously, he's, as a dancer, as a professional dancer, he has like a classical looking body, right? We had to shrink his genitals because it was so insane. I was like, I want it to be crazy, but it's too crazy. So anyway, so when it was shown during Nuit Blanche, of course, everybody wants to take pictures of his penis for good reason. You know, so everyone's like shy and like, you know, I want to take a picture of the art, but we know what they're talking about. But I like this idea that the object kind of is looking at us as viewers, is even misdirecting our looking. We're not looking at his face, we're looking at his other parts. Or we're looking at, who knows, his toe. I don't know what people look at. But I like this idea that the object has a very explicit, it's almost like the demonstration, that print, that it thematizes something very embodied about the situation of visiting a space to look at stuff, look at rug hook representations of buildings that no longer exist. You know, we're looking at stuff, and that stuff, in this case, I try for it to like very clearly address its context and the fact that other people come to check it out, to look at it, to take their selfies with it. Cool. It was really beautiful also to see, like, with the vitrines, like the interaction of people at Nuit Blanche. Like, what's really wild about Nuit Blanche is, or events like these, kind of these arts festivals that are kind of art and kind of entertainment and kind of spectacle, is that they involve a very complex audience, right? They're not all like regular art gallery goers. There's people that just want to get drunk and party all night. There's people on dates. There's, I don't know, grandparents. There's like, it's a much more mixed audience than, strictly speaking, like art spaces sometimes. And it was very lovely, actually, I love to just kind of like be a spy in my own exhibitions and just kind of like stand on the corner and just see how the piece is working in time and in action. And I love like eavesdropping on people, like when they're looking at the books, like people trade stories, right? Like Toronto is a place where so many people who live in Toronto don't come from Toronto. They've come from somewhere else. And, you know, I would hear people, like old ladies, like say like, oh, I remember when Toronto looked like this and whatever, or this is when I arrived in Toronto, you know, I remember it looked like this. They hadn't built this thing yet, or they had just finished building this thing. And those kind of narratives, I think, they're valuable to me in how an artwork can have different entry points, different windows that people for different investments are there that they can kind of tap into. So, so it relates to things that I personally am very interested in that I've tried to talk about, but I think there's also other ways into the piece. So it's, I don't know, it's really sweet just to see that kind of play out. There's a hand there. I'm very interested in the idea of exhibitions. So when I do an exhibition, of course I work really hard on the objects and the artworks, but an exhibition is a full context. And that is what I think as an artist I'm trying to present, right? And as viewers, I think that's what we are present in an exhibition, is the relationship of the context. And we are more alert to our context, because I don't know about you, but like as soon as I walk into a gallery, I look more like than I do outside, you know? Maybe not all the time, but like you start to notice things. You notice the lighting, you notice the carpet, and how that influences how you look at something on the wall. You think about the label. I mean, that part of the context is so huge, right? Like what's the contextual information provided by the gallery that it invites you to look at it like this, but not like that or like that, right? And so I'm glad that you saw that this context kind of creates a kind of overall field of sense or something like that. I mean, the framing, the gesture of creating a frame, creating a framing device, has to do with questions of inclusion and exclusion, right? And even the phrase, the white cube, speaks to all sorts of inclusions and exclusions. Personally, I think it's important to recognize that how connected at the umbilical cord those two concepts are, right? I think exclusion is necessary to include anything, right? To observe something is at the same time to occlude something, to eclipse something else, right? Maybe, I don't think that's the only way to think about things. Like, I imagine other people think it's possible to include everything, to be universal, to account for everything in one thing. I don't subscribe to that myself. I believe in questions of inclusion. I take seriously questions of exclusion. But I think those two concepts are kind of like, it's kind of like the vacant lot in the Tango Garden. They create each other, they produce each other. It's the dynamic that's the real thing that's happening. So I don't know if I'm like kind of circling around your question, but looking back on this piece from the perspective of these later artworks, I think about questions of like inside and outside, inclusion and exclusion. You know, John McCurley from Life of a Crabhead spoke at the Flotilla Conference about the glass ceiling and the bamboo ceiling, about a female Asian student in tech sciences, how there's like a glass ceiling for women in terms of like advancing in a workplace. And he spoke about a bamboo ceiling that Asian people are allowed to progress within that field, but not in a managerial position, but in other positions. And I think these questions of inside and outside are dramatized as I look back to this piece retroactively. There's a kind of like elegance to it, which like kind of softens the politics of what I just said. But when I talked about the gray carpet as a kind of sickness, I'm hinting that that elegance has a sickness built into it. I don't know, I love the Sphinx idea, the kind of, you know, the Sphinx, I don't know that much about like ancient mythology, but what I like about the idea of Sphinx is this entity that speaks in riddles, it speaks in questions. It doesn't say this is what I'm talking about. It kind of creates an empty space where what is being talked about is designated in a weird way. And I feel the headlessness activates that. The frame of the emptiness of the headlessness emphasizes that. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know who's doing the looking. Like if it has no head, it can't be doing the looking. And yet I can't say it's not looking at me, you know? So I think, I guess maybe in some way, like to kind of circle back on the vacant lot idea, it's to kind of activate and animate the blankness, the emptiness, you know, and give it an animus. Yeah, that's the kind of Sphinx-like thing I find this so weird about. Uh-huh. Yeah, they were kind of like in simple, like vitrine kind of tabletops. No, no. It's crazy, Nuit Blanche. And these are my treasures. Yeah, that's true. About look but don't touch protocols. Yeah, I really felt that even only at the level of graphic design, there's something. I wasn't personally so interested in kind of like being able to read the books, although as interesting as that would undoubtedly be. That these objects do carry something of the spirit in which they were made and the assumptions that they make, that spirit is making about this thing called Toronto. You know, so when I showed you kind of like where is it? These historical documents, there's a spirit in these objects. There's a spirit in these graphs, in these drawings, in these representations. It's the spirit that I'm interested in. Like, what does it take to see or to depict the environment like this? Like, what spirit is speaking in that? You know, and it hasn't gone away. Like, I think it's, you know, like haunting us with other competing spirits, other competing ways of being, representing, describing. Yeah, and I felt like it was sufficient to see almost at a graphic design level that spirit kind of shine through. You know, like, yeah, Toronto, the exciting city. You know, and here they had just finished making the city hall. So this is the vacant lot. This is what was put in the vacant lot. It's a beautiful building. I love Villiers Ravel's architecture. It was built at the same time as Mies van der Rohe's first building for the Toronto Dominion headquarters. So this is the first tower of what is now 5 or 6 towers. I think he designed 3 or 4, but then they kind of altered his original plan. But this like monochrome that's just kind of like, monolith, that's just kind of crash landed in the city. It makes me think of like Stanley Kubrick's like 2001 and like these people like, what is this shape? Like it doesn't look like anything human. So a kind of like vision of like a new modernity arriving in the city at this time, and they're calling it the exciting city. It's interesting that they didn't use capital letters. This kind of also modern idea of kind of like, if we're all within a kind of system, there's a kind of horizontality to it. So it's funny, it's, the vision of the skyscraper on the one hand, that's a kind of symbol, and on the other hand, the symbol of the sans serif, lowercase. Those are two visions that are kind of at odds, You can think of like capital letters as kind of skyscrapers, and they're trying to do both. Like, that's weird, that's interesting. I haven't heard that Toronto the proper. I've heard, what have I heard? I've heard many things, but proper not. But it was known as an extremely boring, conservative, yawn town for sure. Toronto the good, that's it, thank you. Yeah, which my understanding is that it's a kind of like a religious connotation and a moralistic connotation. Yes, for all the devastation that the modern urban planning has unleashed on the city fabric, I think that there is a kind of like process of secularizing that has happened, where a certain kind of like moral Toronto has been unleashed or loosened from the reins of power. It's still there. There's like endless debates on whether to have one shelf of beer in a supermarket. So this Victorian Toronto is like, please, what century are we in? But yeah, I do think it's trying to kind of undo a narrative of Toronto the good. It's trying to say Toronto the exciting. That's a different model being proposed, right? Yeah. I call them monochromes, but I'm lying. I guess I should be calling them duochromes, except for these two, which are true monochromes. So I'm not being very technical about the designation, but I hear what you're asking. I've always called these shapes monochromes. I was making them since I was 20. I don't know why. Well, you know what? I just caught a glimpse of something. Kind of like how I said that it's not whether the vacant lot is what Toronto is really about, or even what the Tango Garden is really what the Toronto is about. I think it's the tension between those two things that is the real of Toronto, or one of the ways in which we can describe that, the real. My point being that it's that tension between two separate things which are not separate that provides the coherent, sense-giving concept for Toronto. I kind of see that idea in calling these monochromes, right? That it's in the point of contact of two different colors that kind of creates a third color that I could call, that's the color of that monochrome. I think that way of thinking is consistent to this thing I've been kind of saying later. You asked about kind of like the choice of colors, I think. I wanted to create an atmosphere and almost like a smell and a temperature. And I think I tried very hard for that to happen. I don't know if that actually happened, but what would I say about that smell or temperature? It's a little cool. It's a little, I don't know, maybe it's like Lake Ontario-y. I'm not conscious about this, I'm making this up, but like, It feels like Lake Ontario, like the temperature of the water to me. It feels about the overcast of Toronto through most of the year, so when it's not summer. It's calming. It's also sorry, I'm just riffing. I also think it's the idea of seeing heterogeneity when you first saw homogeneity. That you see actually a ton of colors where on the first glimpse you saw, oh, these are all gray paintings. That there are no true grays there. There's like a green gray and a blue gray and a warm gray and a cold gray. And that you start to kind of, a previously unseen heterogeneity becomes apparent through the gesture of remaining in that space rather than just like, yep, you know? Yeah, so I guess that's some of the things I would say about that. I wish I was organized enough to be an archivist. I can't pretend to be. I'm very disorganized. But I'm a hoarder. I love collecting stuff. Like once I get on a track, I just want to see all of it, like get into it, like dive into it. I don't have to own it, but I love diving into things. So there's a kind of discipline to it in the sense that I want to take it all, like in the sense of like experience it. And so that's a kind of archive. And sometimes that archive is like, you know, a box full of books in my storage or on my bookshelf. Sometimes that archive is like, I don't know, my MP3 player with like my collection of music. Sometimes that archive is just like memory and like resonances of like, oh yeah, that person did that artwork. Oh my God, it's talking about this thing that I'm trying to think about. So there's a kind of curating of the imagination. You know, like the artist Michael Morris said, the artist is a curator of the imagination. I think that's wild. Like, I think that's really beautiful way to describe artistic work that has something to do with imagination, but it also has something to do with dealing with what's already there. And I think this question of the archive is dealing with the stuff that's there. Like, what do you do with the stuff that's just, that you've inherited just because you weren't born at the beginning of time? You're born at a moment in time into a world that already has stuff in it, you know? Archive is to kind of deal with that question. Curate is to deal with that question. Like, people are making stuff. What do we do with it? How do we allow that stuff to help us make sense or complicate or the sense we already have of things? Yeah. But I wouldn't pretend to be like as systematic about it as the word archivist might suggest, because I'm not. Anybody else? Well, thanks again.